She flinched when he stepped near her, the sound of boots, the weight of the hat, the snap of leather gloves. It reminded her of something, back in the jungle, back in the dark. But then the cowboy, a sun-darkened man with a rifle slung casually across his back, looked her in the eye, not like a captor, not like an enemy, like something else. And then he said 2 words. "You hungry?" The ranch fell silent. The other POWs froze, hands full of feed, standing between horses and fences. The ranch hands looked up from the barn, and the wind seemed to still, because those 2 words weren't just a question. They were a rupture. They shattered something the war had planted in every one of them, the belief that kindness could only be a trick. The Japanese woman stared at him, her lips parting in disbelief. And in that instant, the entire ranch, horses, men, sky, seemed to hold its breath. She didn't answer him. Couldn't. Her mouth was dry, her legs trembling from the journey, the hunger, the weight of everything she'd been told to expect. The cowboy didn't press. He simply tipped his hat, nodded once, and walked off, his boots crunching over gravel as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But it had, for her, for the others standing beside her, dust clinging to their uniforms, faces still smudged from the train ride. That moment carved itself into memory. "You hungry?" Not shouted, not barked, offered. Like an ordinary question on an ordinary day. But nothing about this day was ordinary. They were women dragged across the world in the belly of a war machine, and now they stood in Texas, the land of wide skies and wider silences, waiting for cruelty that did not arrive. They had expected cages, armed dogs, punishment. Instead, they were led through a wide gate, flanked by weather-worn fence posts and strands of barbed wire that gleamed faintly in the morning sun. A ranch. That was the word that came to mind, absurd and impossible. Horses nickered from a corral nearby, and a line of cattle meandered along a distant hill. This was not a prison, not as they had imagined it. The guards wore uniforms, yes, but not the kind made for brutality. Khaki, dusty, with sweat-darkened collars and sunburnt necks. Some had pistols. None pointed them. The dust was everywhere, in their mouths, in their sleeves, in the cracks of their memories. It coated the hem of her skirt as she stepped off the back of the truck, blinking against the sunlight. She squinted at the barn beyond the wire. A man was lifting hay bales, swinging them with easy rhythm. Another hammered something on a post, the thudding slow and steady. The air smelled of horse sweat, sun-baked wood, and coffee. That last scent jolted her. Coffee? Her eyes searched for its source, as if to catch it in the act. Beside her, another woman whispered in Japanese, "What is this place?" But no one answered. No one could, because they had all stepped out of one world and into another, and the rules here were unwritten. The cowboy who had spoken those 2 words leaned against a fence post some distance away, eyes shaded beneath his hat, arms crossed like a man watching a storm blow in from the south. He said nothing else, didn't need to. His stillness was unnerving, not hostile, just calm. The women waited for the moment the quiet would snap, when laughter would rise behind their backs, when someone would push them, curse them, humiliate them. It didn't come. They were shown their quarters. A long wooden barrack with cots spaced along both walls, no chains, no guards inside, just beds, thin mattresses, wool blankets folded at the foot. The woman paused at the door, her instincts screaming that this was a trap. She remembered the jungle camps, damp, foul places where disease bloomed like mold, but here sunlight filtered through slats in the wall. A fan creaked overhead. The walls were made of real timber, not bamboo. The air moved. When a rancher passed too close, she flinched hard, shrinking back like a struck animal. He only stepped aside, nodding politely, and continued past. That made it worse, the lack of threat. Her body didn't know how to carry itself without fear. It was built into her posture, her breath, her silence. For weeks on the ship, for days on the train, they had clung to a singular belief that this land would break them, that humiliation was certain, that starvation was likely, that pain would be the only constant. But here, the routine was precise, not cruel, just consistent. Feed at 6, work assignments posted by 7, no shouting, no blows. Horses were fed before humans. That fact stunned her. In her country, even soldiers fought for millet rations and died with empty stomachs. But these Americans, these cowboys, gave oats to animals before speaking a single word to the prisoners. She sat on the edge of her cot that evening, watching the sun dissolve over the horizon like melting copper. Her hands lay in her lap, clenched and still. Her body had been taught to brace, for punishment, for insult, for assault, and yet none had come. Not yet. And that made it worse, in a way, because now the question began to bloom at the back of her mind. If the enemy was not what she had been told, what else had been a lie? She wasn't ready to ask it out loud, not yet. Even thinking it felt like betrayal. So instead, she looked away from the sunset, tucked her hands beneath the scratchy blanket, and tried to remember the last night she had believed anything at all. But memory, like the Texas wind, did not come softly. It dragged her backward over oceans and months until she was once again 19 years old, standing in a mud-slick training yard in Hiroshima, repeating the code of Bushido until her voice cracked. Better to die than be taken. They made her say it over and over, in drills, in ceremonies, before meals. It seeped into the bones. It was not just a rule, it was a legacy. Her instructors never smiled, never softened. They stood like stone, voices hard with patriotism, faces carved by certainty. Surrender was not defeat, it was erasure, a crime so deep it defiled ancestors. And she believed it because belief was survival, and questioning was a luxury she could not afford. She had volunteered for the medical corps because she was told it was service, because she had seen her brothers leave, because she wanted to be of use. Her mother packed her rations with silent pride, rice bowls wrapped in cloth, a sachet of pickled plums, dried fish that smelled like memory. The last time they embraced, her mother had said only, "Do not shame us." Not come home safe, not I love you, just that. The weight of honor carried on 6 words. The hospital tent in Luzon was nothing like the ones in the training manuals. There was no order, no clean lines of beds, no rhythm to the madness. It was blood and heat, and the droning buzz of flies. Amputations done with hands that shook from fatigue, screams muffled by cloth. The jungle pressed in from all sides, hot and green and watching. She learned quickly how to bind a stump, how to ration morphine like gold, how to look at dying men and say, "You will live," even when she knew they wouldn't. Then the bombs came, then the shooting, and then the silence. Her unit was overrun in the middle of the night. The command post had long since abandoned them. She remembered dragging a wounded soldier under a tarp, covering his mouth as he cried. She remembered the bayonets glinting in the tree line. But most of all, she remembered the order that never came, the one that was supposed to say, "Die before surrender." Instead, she had lived. The moment of capture was not loud. It was a voice, in English, telling her to lower her hands, a flashlight, a gun, a man's eyes that looked tired, not triumphant. She waited for pain, for shame, for something to confirm that she was broken. But nothing happened. They gave her water. They gave her space. The shame came anyway, but it was silent, thick, poisonous. On the boat to America, she barely spoke. Days blurred into steel-gray sky and endless ocean. The women were given meals, rice, sometimes bread, sometimes meat. Some refused. She did not. She ate mechanically, as if feeding a stranger. Her mind had emptied itself. That was the only way to survive. Forget the smell of home, forget her mother's hands, forget the words burned into her spine. By the time they arrived in California, she had become something else. Not a woman, not a soldier, not even a prisoner, just a shape that moved when ordered. The numbness clung to her through the train ride, through the endless fences of this foreign land, and finally into the dust and silence of the Texas ranch. But now something was stirring beneath the numbness, something fragile, dangerous. She didn't have a name for it yet, only a feeling, the memory of bread that didn't taste like punishment, of a sentence spoken with softness, of a man in a hat who asked, "You hungry?" And that memory was not numb, it was warm, and that terrified her more than anything else. The warmth was dangerous because it asked questions she wasn't ready to answer. It came not as fire, but as a slow ember, small, glowing, persistent. It came in the form of quiet things. A clean shirt folded at the end of her cot, a biscuit left wrapped in paper on the step outside the barracks, a canteen of cool water placed beside her when no one was looking. It wasn't charity, it wasn't pity, it was something harder to name, something that didn't fit inside the rules of war she had memorized. The cowboy never told her his name. Maybe that was mercy. A name would make him real, make him harder to hate. But she watched him. They all did. He moved like he belonged to the land, not above it, not beside it, but as if the dirt, the sky, the fences, and the cattle had shaped him. He spoke rarely. When he did, his voice was low and even, never rushed, never sharp. Mornings came early. A bell rang once at dawn. The women stirred under their blankets, blinking against the gray light. Outside, the men were already working, leading horses to water, checking the cattle fences, hammering loose boards. No shouting, no barking orders, just rhythm. Tools clanked against wood. Boots brushed over packed earth. A dog barked once and was quiet. The ranch breathed like a living thing, slow and steady. She began to recognize the cowboy's patterns. He saddled his horse the same way each morning. He tied knots with a precision that felt like ritual. When he passed the barracks, he never looked directly at her, but sometimes he'd leave something behind. Once it was a comb. Another time, a clean rag and a small tin of salve for the blister on her heel. She never saw him place them, but she knew it was him. Who else moved like that, quiet as a breeze, steady as a clock? And yet each gesture twisted inside her like a knot. She had learned how to endure cruelty. She had armor for hunger, discipline for fear. But kindness? Kindness had no rules, no defenses. It arrived without warning, without price, and left her exposed. The first time she bit into the biscuit, still warm at its center, her body shuddered. She hadn't tasted flour in so long. Real flour, not the chalky imitation they used in the jungle. She ate in silence, her throat thick, every bite a betrayal of everything she had believed. Then there was the shirt, simple cotton, soft from washing, no holes, no bloodstains. She stared at it for an hour before touching it. Her old blouse was stiff with sweat and memory. Putting on something clean felt obscene, like stealing dignity she hadn't earned. But when she finally slipped the shirt over her arms, something loosened in her chest. It smelled of starch and sunlight. It smelled impossibly like safety. Later that week, she was handed a tin mug. Coffee. Real coffee. Not the bitter grain substitute they had brewed in desperation, but something dark and rich, steaming in the cool morning air. She hesitated. The warmth seeped through the metal into her fingers. She sipped. Her eyes stung. It wasn't just the taste, it was the shock that she was allowed this, that someone, somewhere, had decided she was worth a cup of coffee. Still, she said nothing, not to the other women, not to the guards, not to the cowboy. But something had cracked. Not broken, not yet, but cracked. Each comfort was a chisel against the wall inside her. Each act of quiet decency made her question which world was the illusion, the one she had come from, or the one she now lived in. Because if this enemy, this cowboy, could offer her warmth without demand, what did that make her? A prisoner, a survivor, or something else entirely? She didn't know. All she knew was that, for the first time since the war began, she wasn't bracing for pain. She was waiting for the next kindness. And that terrified her even more, because if it kept coming, the coffee, the shirt, the biscuit, something inside her would eventually break, or bend. She didn't know which would be worse, so she stayed quiet, kept her eyes low, did her work without comment. She mucked stalls, filled troughs, folded sheets, scrubbed boots. And she watched. The ranch moved like a tide, predictable, slow, never still. The American men spoke softly to the horses, patting their flanks as if they were old friends. Even the animals seemed unafraid. There was no yelling, no sudden violence, just an understanding built from repetition. The prisoners, mostly men now, a few other women like herself, began to relax, bit by bit. They joked in hushed tones. Some started to hum while they worked. One man carved a tiny bird from a scrap of wood and gave it to the youngest woman among them. She smiled once, but she remained apart. Not because she wanted to, she didn't even know what she wanted, but because the distance felt safer than hope. Hope had teeth. Hope was the first step toward shame. Still, the fence no longer looked like a cage. It wasn't even electrified, just wood and wire, the kind a farmer might use to keep cattle from wandering. She could walk its length in the morning without drawing attention. And sometimes she did, tracing her fingers over the rough grain of the posts, watching birds land and fly as if the fence wasn't even there. One evening, just after supper, she lingered outside. The sky had turned that strange American color, deep orange melting into purple like the horizon had been dipped in fire. The air smelled of manure, sweat, and something warm from the kitchen. She stood near the barn, arms folded, gaze drifting, and then she heard it, a harmonica. The notes came slowly, unsure at first, as if the instrument had to clear its throat. But then the melody steadied, a low, wandering tune. Not cheerful, not sad, just familiar, not in its notes, but in its intention. It reminded her of the lullabies her mother used to hum while folding laundry, back when the world still made sense. She turned, slowly. On the edge of the porch sat a boy, a rancher's son, perhaps 16 or 17. His hair was a mess of straw, his boots too large for his legs, but he played with his eyes closed, like the music was something he'd found in the dirt and couldn't quite name. The other prisoners stilled, conversations faded, even the guards paused. No one spoke, and she felt something inside her, not shatter, not explode, but soften, just slightly. It was not just music, it was permission, to feel, to remember, to exist in a moment that had nothing to do with survival. But almost instantly another voice rose inside her, sharp, disciplined, trained. They are the enemy. Do not be fooled. Her spine stiffened. She looked away. Still, the melody lingered. It clung to her as she walked back to the barracks. It followed her into sleep. The next morning, while sweeping the steps, she found herself humming. Just a fragment, barely audible, but it was there. That evening she saw the boy again, harmonica tucked in his pocket. He saw her too, nodded once, nothing more. And in that quiet exchange, something changed, because fences, she realized, don't just keep people in. Sometimes they keep the war out. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, a ranch hand approached her. He was tall, older than the others, his face lined and weathered like the leather of his gloves. He didn't speak at first, just stood beside her as she swept the dust from the porch, letting silence settle between them like a question. Then, gently, he said, "You want to help with the horses today?" Her first instinct was suspicion. A test? A trick? A trap designed to prove her weakness? She turned her eyes toward the corral where the horses stood, swishing their tails in the morning light. Her fingers clenched around the broom handle. But then something, hunger, boredom, maybe the echo of a harmonica, nudged her forward. She nodded once, not out of trust, just curiosity. He handed her a saddle, heavy, awkward. The leather creaked in her arms as she struggled to balance it. It was larger than she'd expected, unfamiliar in every way. She shifted her weight, trying not to drop it. Her eyes darted up, ready for laughter, for scorn. But the man just smiled, not unkindly, and said, "Like this." He reached over, adjusted her grip, shifted the saddle in her arms so the horn rested against her chest and the stirrups dangled freely. It was a small correction, nothing more, but it landed with force. No shouting, no ridicule, just a correction offered like water from a well. Her breath caught. She stared at her hands. They were not trembling. The corral smelled of dust and hay, warm animal breath and old wood. The horses moved with quiet dignity. One stepped toward her, a dappled mare with dark eyes. The ranch hand murmured something low and soothing, and the horse stilled. He motioned for her to come closer. She hesitated, then stepped forward, saddle still in her arms. "Go slow," he said. "Let her see you." She reached out a hand. The mare's nose was soft, velvety, warm. For a moment they simply stood there, woman and animal, breathing the same air. Then, with careful movements, the man helped her lift the saddle onto the mare's back. He guided her fingers through the straps, showed her the cinch, adjusted the blanket. Each gesture was instructional, never invasive. He moved slowly, patiently, always leaving space for her to find the motion herself. When the saddle was secure, she stepped back. Her shirt clung to her back. The sun had risen higher now, gilding the fence posts and dust with a kind of quiet magic. The ranch hand gave a nod, said nothing, and walked away. She stood there a while longer, watching the mare swish her tail, stomp once, then settle. Her arms ached, but not from punishment, from effort, honest effort. She looked down at her hands. These were not the hands of an enemy, not any more. They had been trained to hold stretchers, to wrap wounds, to fold behind her back in submission. But today they had lifted a saddle. They had touched an animal without fear. They had been corrected without shame. And in that, there, was a strange, fragile power. Because for the first time, accepting help hadn't felt like surrender. It had felt like something else entirely. It had felt like learning, and maybe, just maybe, learning was a different kind of freedom. The next morning, after roll call and before chores, a guard, not unkind, not friendly, just neutral, handed her a small stack of lined paper and a pencil. "If you want," he said, nodding toward the others. Some had already begun scribbling. "You can write home." She took the paper slowly, unsure if it was a mistake. Home? That word had lived in a sealed chamber of her mind, untouched, unreachable. The idea of writing to her family felt dangerous. But the pencil was warm from his hand, and the paper fluttered like breath. She sat cross-legged on the porch, knees tucked beneath her borrowed skirt, and placed the first sheet across her lap. The pencil hovered. Her fingers felt stiff, unpracticed. She had written nothing in months, not since the day her father bowed to her before she left, a gesture of quiet dignity that had broken something in her chest. He had said nothing, just bowed once, low and deep. That memory had clung to her like smoke through every stage of capture. She began, "Mother." The word hit harder than she expected. She stared at it. The paper blurred for a moment before she blinked it clear. "I am on a ranch. Simple. True. But it didn't sound real. They give me stew." That made her pause. She could picture the bowl from last night, thick with potatoes, tender meat, steam curling in the twilight air. A spoon, not her fingers, a full stomach. "They give me work." That part was harder to explain. It wasn't forced labor, not like in the jungle. It wasn't sweat under a whip. It was care, repetition, purpose, folding things, cleaning things, saddling horses. Work that built something instead of breaking it down. "I do not understand this country." She stopped there, pencil hovering again. That sentence felt honest. More than anything, it captured the strangeness that had followed her since stepping on American soil. A place of enemies who didn't act like enemies. A place where fences held no teeth and music drifted through dinner. She folded the letter carefully, even though she knew, as all of them did, that it would never be sent. Still, the act of writing it had stirred something, a reclaiming, a quiet defiance. In writing, she had reconnected with the part of herself that wasn't just a uniform, a prisoner, a number. She had a mother. She had a past. Later, while gathering eggs near the back of the barn, she passed two American women, ranch wives, likely, or daughters. They were hanging laundry on a line, the breeze tugging at the fabric like a child's hand. One looked up and met her eyes, not with pity, not with contempt, just curiosity. And something else, something close to recognition. Neither spoke, but they didn't look away either. She carried the eggs in a woven basket, hands steady, spine straight. That morning she had combed her hair with the comb the cowboy had left. She had washed her face in cold water. And now, with the letter folded beneath her mattress, she felt different. Not free, not safe, not yet, but whole. She would write again tomorrow. She didn't care if the letters reached Japan. That wasn't the point. Writing them made her real to herself, and that, in a place designed to erase her, was its own kind of survival. The afternoon the fire started, the sky was too quiet. The heat pressed down like a hand on the back of her neck, heavier than usual, the air dry enough to sting when she breathed. Even the cicadas had gone silent. She was in the far pasture, helping another woman gather tools left near the fence line, when the first shout cut through the stillness. Smoke. At first it was only a thin ribbon curling upward beyond the tall grass, gray against the hard blue sky. Then it thickened, darkened, moved. Wind swept across the field, and the ribbon became a wall. Someone yelled again, louder this time. Horses began to shift, snorting, hooves stamping the dirt. Panic spread faster than flame. She smelled it before she saw it fully, Sharp, bitter, unmistakable. Burning brush, dry grass igniting like paper. The fire raced low and fast, fed by weeks without rain. Ranch hands shouted orders now, voices cutting through the haze. Gates were thrown open. Someone ran toward the corral. A horse bolted. The animal broke from the line, eyes wide, muscles bunched tight with terror. It barreled toward the far end of the pasture where a young American boy stood frozen, no more than 8 or 9, clutching a bucket in his hands. He didn't move. Couldn't. The horse closed the distance in seconds. She didn't think. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. The jungle had trained her well, not in mercy, but in instinct. She dropped the tools and ran. The ground blurred beneath her feet. She reached the boy just as the horse thundered past, close enough that the wind of it knocked her sideways. She grabbed the child and rolled hard into the dirt, dragging him beneath the low wooden water trough as embers began to fall like black snow. Smoke swallowed them. She curled around the boy, her back to the fire, arms locked tight around his small frame. He screamed once, then coughed, burying his face against her chest. Heat scorched the air. Ash filled her mouth. Her lungs burned, and suddenly she was no longer in Texas. She was back in the jungle, back on her knees in the mud, carrying a soldier whose blood soaked through her uniform, back under a canvas tarp as shells exploded nearby, back whispering, "Hold on," to men who could not hear her. The same weight, the same urgency, the same certainty that if she let go, someone would die. The fire roared past the trough, flames licking high before racing onward, chasing the wind. Time stretched and collapsed all at once. Then, slowly, the heat receded. The smoke thinned. Shouts grew clearer. Footsteps pounded closer. She coughed violently, chest heaving. Her arms ached. The boy was crying now, sharp and breathless, alive. She tightened her hold, rocking him once without realizing she was doing it. When the smoke finally cleared enough to see, faces appeared above them. Ranch hands, guards. Someone lifted the trough. Hands reached in. The boy was pulled free first, passed from arm to arm, soot streaking his cheeks. Then she was helped up, unsteady on her feet, her clothes blackened, hair dusted gray with ash. She stood there, coughing, eyes stinging, heart pounding, and realized she was still holding the boy's hand. She let go slowly. Across the field, near the fence line, the cowboy stood watching. His hat was pulled low. Smoke drifted past him in lazy coils. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he tipped his hat, just once. Not a gesture meant for others, just for her. It wasn't gratitude, it wasn't surprise, it was respect. And in that quiet nod, something inside her settled. She had not saved an enemy child. She had saved a child. The fire was eventually contained. Blackened grass smoldered under the watchful eye of men with shovels and water buckets. The ranch breathed again. That night, as she washed the soot from her hands, she realized her fingers were steady. The war had taken many things from her, but it had not taken this, the instinct to protect life, no matter whose it was. After the fire, the air on the ranch changed. Not in temperature, but in tone. Something unseen had shifted. A current, a weight, a silence lifted. The American boy she had saved didn't return the next morning, but a small wooden horse appeared on the step outside her barracks, whittled by a child's hand, rough in detail but careful in form. She understood the message. Gratitude needed no translation. From that day forward, she was no longer just a number, no longer just the nurse or the Japanese woman. She had stepped across an invisible line, not drawn by command or permission, but by action. She was part of the rhythm now, the slow, steady machinery of the ranch that ran on sweat, sunlight, and silence. She found herself brushing the horses without being asked, moving alongside the ranch hands with quiet precision. One morning, the older rancher, the one who had first shown her how to hold a saddle, passed her a bridle without a word. She took it. Their eyes met. That was enough. She began to laugh again, not often and never loudly, but once, while brushing down the dappled mare, the brush snagged on a knot in the tail, and she muttered a word in Japanese under her breath. The horse flicked its ear and stepped sideways, bumping her with its flank. She laughed, surprised by the sound of it. So did the cowboy, who was nearby mending a fence. He didn't say anything, just kept working, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Other women began to follow her lead. There was a quiet shift in the barracks, the way clothes were folded more carefully, the way they started greeting the guards with nods instead of silence. One even braided her hair again, using a comb that had been passed around like a relic, the same one the cowboy had left weeks ago. The changes were not dramatic. No speeches, no songs of allegiance. But when one woman offered to help carry a feed sack without being told, and another stopped to fix a loose hinge on the gate, it was clear. They were no longer surviving out of duty. They were living, piece by piece. One afternoon, while planting seeds in a side plot near the chicken coop, she began to hum. Not loud, just under her breath. It wasn't even a real song, just a chain of notes, the way her mother used to hum while planting herbs in clay pots on their balcony. The wind picked it up, carried it through the fence line. The cowboy, passing by on horseback, slowed. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He just tipped his hat and kept riding, the sun behind him turning the dust golden. That garden plot became something sacred. The soil was dry, but the seeds took. Squash, beans, even tomatoes. Each day she and another woman tended it, watering, clearing weeds, patting the dirt with care. It wasn't about food, it was about proof that something could grow here, that they could shape something beyond obedience. The war was still happening. Somewhere beyond the fences, bombs still fell. Orders were still given. But here, on this quiet stretch of American land, healing took root. Not loudly, not perfectly, but undeniably. If you're finding this story as powerful as we do, please tap the like button and drop a comment below letting us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The news came without ceremony. No sirens, no flags, just a folded piece of paper passed from one guard to another, then a quiet gathering near the barn as the sun leaned west. The cowboy stood off to the side, arms crossed, hat low, while an officer cleared his throat and spoke words that felt too large for the open air. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The prisoners would be going home. For a moment, no one reacted. The words hung there, weightless and unreal. Going home. The phrase echoed in her chest like a sound heard underwater. She had imagined many endings to the war: death in the jungle, disappearance in a camp, silence, but not this. Not standing in a pasture, dirt under her nails, the smell of hay in the air, being told she would return. Her knees weakened. She steadied herself against the fence. Around her, others began to murmur. One woman covered her mouth with both hands. Another sank to the ground, sobbing without sound. A few men laughed, sharp and disbelieving. But she could not move, because in her mind the war had already ended. It had ended the day a man in a hat looked at her and asked, "You hungry?" That was the moment the rules she had lived by collapsed. The moment the world cracked open and revealed something softer beneath the steel. Everything since then, the saddle, The letters, the fire, the garden had felt like an afterword, a quiet coda. Now she was being asked to return to a country that still believed surrender was shame, to a people who might never understand that captivity had saved her soul. That night she did not sleep. She lay awake on her cot, staring at the wooden beams overhead, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch, crickets, distant hooves, the low murmur of men talking near the fence. Her stomach twisted with a guilt she could not name. She had eaten well while others starved. She had slept under blankets while cities burned. She had learned gentleness from the enemy. How could she carry that home? What words could explain a kindness that contradicted everything she had been taught? What face would her mother make if she spoke of stew instead of suffering, of work instead of wounds? Would they see her as a survivor, or a traitor softened by mercy? In the days that followed, preparations began. Lists were made, belongings sorted. The garden was harvested early, its last fruits shared among the prisoners and ranch hands alike. She picked the final tomatoes with care, wiping the dirt from her fingers as if memorizing the feel of that soil. On her last morning she rose before dawn. The ranch was still, wrapped in pale light. She folded the borrowed shirt she had worn so often, smoothing the creases with reverent hands. She tucked her unsent letters into her bag, and then she walked, one last time, to the fence. The cowboy was already there. He did not approach, he did not speak. He only stood, watching the horizon, as if he had always been there and always would be. She stopped a few paces away. For a long moment neither moved. The distance between them was small, but full of everything that had passed without words. She bowed, not deep, not formal, just enough. He tipped his hat. That was all. No thanks, no farewell, no explanation, just a gesture that said, "I see you. I always did." As she turned away, the weight in her chest did not lift, but it shifted. The kindness she had lived through did not erase the war that came before. It did something far more complicated. It followed her, and she knew, with a certainty that both steadied and frightened her, that the hardest part of her journey was not behind her. It was waiting across the ocean, in the land that had taught her to die, not to live. She left the ranch the same way she had arrived, in silence. But this silence was not the same. It no longer hummed with suspicion or fear. It was reverent, like the quiet that follows a hymn. In her arms she carried the saddle blanket the cowboy had folded and handed her without a word. Worn, woolen, and sun-warmed, it was not a gift so much as a gesture, a bridge that did not need building any more. On the ship bound for Japan, she slept beneath it every night. The sea was wide and the future uncertain, but wrapped in the coarse fabric that smelled faintly of dust and leather, she felt anchored to something unspoken. Around her, the other women held small things too, trinkets, carvings, worn shirts, not stolen, not claimed, simply carried, pieces of a place that had surprised them. The closer they got to Yokohama, the heavier the blanket felt. Not in weight, but in meaning. Back home, the city was half rubble, half memory. Tokyo had changed in ways she hadn't imagined. Narrow alleys widened by firebombs, streetcars that ran past craters, neighborhoods with no names anymore. But some things endured. Her childhood home stood, scorched, but standing. Her mother's garden was gone, replaced by weeds, but the stone path remained. She never spoke in detail about the ranch. Not to the neighbors, not to her cousins, not even to her husband, whom she married a few years later, a widower who never asked about her time overseas. The war stories shared in post-war Japan were of loss, of betrayal, of unimaginable sacrifice. Hers was different, and that difference could feel like betrayal, too. But she kept the blanket, folded in a wooden chest at the foot of her bed. She took it out once every year, on the day she had first stepped onto American soil. She would sit with it across her lap, her hands tracing the edges like reading a book only she could understand. When her granddaughter asked once, small, wide-eyed, curious in the way only children can be, "Oh, Bosson, what was America like?" she didn't hesitate. "They gave me soap," she said softly. "They gave me silence, and they gave me the two kindest words I ever heard." The girl waited, expectant. Her grandmother smiled, a small, tired smile, but real. "You hungry?" she said, repeating the words as if they still echoed. There was a quiet power in remembering kindness, not the explosive kind, not medals or headlines or parades, but the kind that arrives in silence when no one is looking. A blanket, a biscuit, a hand on a bridle. In time, she taught her granddaughter how to plant herbs, basil, green onions, the same way her own mother had. In spring, they would turn the soil together, side by side, and sometimes she would hum a tune with no name, and the wind would carry it off, just like it did in Texas. She never forgot the war, but she also never forgot the man who asked if she was hungry, the one who didn't need to understand her language to offer her dignity. Some wounds never fully heal, but some kindnesses never fade. If this story moved you, please like the video and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We read everyone,